Can I welcome Reverend David Hardman to Wharton and Clegg's Lane and to the Falmouth and Worsley circuit. I'm sure what he's going to share with us this afternoon we will find very interesting and very topical. So welcome, we look forward to hearing what you've got to say to us.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thanks very much for inviting me, for organising this chance to talk about the situation in Palestine and Israel. Just one or two notices before we begin. Firstly, to say it's been a privilege when I've been doing these talks to have Kathy with me. Kathy has a relationship with a guy in. That makes it sound. I know. Sorry. Not that kind of relationship. Sorry, purely professional relationship, but brings into this country some goods and Palestinian crafts that have been made by people around Bethlehem. The economy there is not good. It's really suffering. So being able to sell some of these things makes a real difference to people's lives. So Kathy's been with me at these talks that I've been giving, and so if you're interested in buying some of this olive wood or other things, then please see Kathy afterwards. Also, just to say, on this table, there is a sign-up sheet if people want to get no more than one email a month from the Methodist Liaison Office, which will keep you up to date with what we do and some of the situations there. And also, there is my business card, which has my email address, because I'm more than happy to be contacted. If you've got questions, if you see something's happening or whatever, and you want to be in touch with me, then please do that. So please feel free to take those there. The other thing that you will notice is that this is being filmed. Okay, so Kevin here from the United Reformed Church was asked to film it because his boss, I think you'll know, Philip Brooks. So Philip was very pleased to see that I'd been invited here, and so suggested that Kevin came and filmed it. So if you don't want to appear on the film, then if you can sit sort of here behind the camera, Kevin will be getting some shots across here. So if you don't want to be on film, just sit on these seats here. And if you want to be on film, then move now. You'll stay there. Yeah. Fair enough. That's good. Okay. Oh, yes. Yes, thanks. Yeah. I normally do say, so if you're thinking, oh, I've not bought enough cash to buy anything from Bethlehem, Kathy's got a card machine. So we're all good there. We're all good there. Okay. I think that's all the notices that I needed to give. So, as has been said, I'm the Reverend David Hardman. I'm Methodist Liaison Officer, Jerusalem. The Methodist Liaison Office is based in Jerusalem, and normally that's where I'm living. And what I would like to do this morning is just talk through a little bit of the situation in Israel, in Palestine, and perhaps get behind some of the news things that you've seen. I'll talk for a bit and then we'll have some questions and answers, because I think it's really important to ask questions and to have those discussions. So if I say something and you think, oh, I've got a question, then just hold on to it and we'll have an opportunity later to ask those questions. I might even be able to answer them. You never know. So I've called this talk Loving Through a Broken Heart. And I want to show you this image. And this image it's actually the view from my window where I live in Jerusalem. I live in St. George's College in Jerusalem, and it's in the same compound as St. George's Cathedral. And when I open the curtains in the morning, I have this view of the cathedral, and it's always sunny. It is always sunny. Well, nearly always sunny. And a while ago, there's a housekeeper that looks after the rooms in St. George's College, and I hadn't seen him for a while, and then he turns up at the college, and I said to him, I said, "Oh, I've not seen you for a while. Have you been off work?" And he went, "No." I said, "Oh, well, you've not been away?" "No." "Oh, have you been ill?" He said, "No." I said, "Well, were you just having some time off? Why haven't I seen you for the last week?" And he said, "Well, because the checkpoint was closed." And the housekeeper is a Palestinian. He lives in Bethany. And if you know your geography in the region, you'll know that Bethany is one side of the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem is the other side of it. So very close to Jerusalem. He just has to come over the Mount of Olives. But Israel had closed the checkpoint because Bethany is behind the concrete wall, the 30-foot concrete wall. And so if the checkpoint is closed, he cannot get to work. And it illustrates something of the life for Palestinians. He's fortunate that he's paid by the college. Many Palestinians will only be paid by the hours that they work. So if they can't get through the checkpoint, then they lose a day's work. And if they can't get through the checkpoint the next day, then use another day, and so on and so forth. And he started then talking to me, and he got quite animated, and he said to me, "Look," he said, "I don't understand why. I don't understand why this happens," he says. "All I want to do is to live my life and then come to work so that I can earn a living and I can feed my family. Why is it that Israel restrict my movement with checkpoints? Why is there a big concrete wall between me and Jerusalem? Why is it that they arrest Palestinians without charge and keep them for month after month after month and then release them without not having charged them? Why is it that I have to have a permit to travel somewhere else to see my family or to go out like anybody else? Why is it?" And he was quite upset. And he said to me, "We try and love, but our hearts are broken. We love through a broken heart." And it's the sort of language that we don't often hear in relation to Israel and Palestine. Quite often we hear words like promised land and Zionism, or we hear settler colonialism or occupation or oppression, apartheid, ethnic cleansing or genocide. Those are the words that we're hearing. Those are the words that people use about the situation. And I was just kind of struck by him using this word loving and using the word broken heart. And it kind of helped me see a different side. But what I want to do this morning is I want to look at some of these words. I want to look at some of them and try and get behind them and understand what they mean and what they mean for Palestinians and Israelis living in the Holy Land, living in that place where, as Christians, we believe Jesus walked a place. That's why we call it the Holy Land. The Jewish people call it the Holy Land because their prophets walked there and they understood what God said to them. And Muslims call it the Holy Land because Muhammad was there and ascended from the rock. And the three Abrahamic faiths call it the Holy Land. But yet it is land torn apart by hatred and violence. So I'm going to start with the Promised Land. So I'm a good Methodist. Well, let's put that another way. I've been a Methodist all my life. And, I grew up and I went to Sunday school as a child and I was taught the stories of the Old Testament. And I was taught something of the Old Testament that talks about the Promised Land, this idea that God gave the land to Jewish people. And of course, this is partly at the heart of what this conflict is about and is often used as a defense for what is happening. And so I've got this Sunday school image here, a map of the early years of the world according to the Bible. So we start with creation. It actually says 4000 BC. We won't talk about that. We won't discuss that theologically. But you go through the Garden of Eden, the fall and the flood, and then you get to this bit that says the patriarchs. And this is the interesting bit. And here's one of the early verses in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures. that talks about the promised land. It says in Genesis 12:7, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give you this land. Now, who are the offspring? Who are the descendants of Abraham? There's not going to be a lot of questions from me to you, but this is one of them that I'm going to ask. Anyone will be brave enough to tell us or hazard a guess? Everybody, I mean, we often talk about that, don't we? Saying that, we are all children of Abraham. And certainly when we talk about Judaism, Islam and Christianity, all of us we are Abrahamic faiths. Abraham is common to us all. In this picture that you can see, we have Isaac. Yeah? Isaac was Abraham's son. But what this picture does not show is Ishmael, who was also Abraham's son. And actually, Ishmael is considered to be the father of the Arabs. And Isaac is the line through which the 12 tribes of Israel came into being. So when this passage says, the Lord appeared to Abraham and promised Abraham's descendants the land, is it purely the 12 tribes of Israel? Or actually is it to more people? And I think it's really important that we ask these questions, because when I was a child and being taught these things, I was just taught that the land was given to Israel, to the Jewish people. But actually, I think it's more subtle than that. Let's move on a bit back to this map. We have the journey to Egypt, the Exodus, 40 years in the wilderness. We have Moses leading people out of Egypt, and he wanders around the desert for 40 years. Unfortunately, he dies before they get to the promised land. That's the story we have. And then we get to what this map describes as the conquest of the promised land. And you can see Joshua there with a helmet and a sword and a breastplate. And I struggle, for one, that we've got this idea of a conquest of the promised land. But Joshua leads the people of Israel, and I've put up here a story that we always tell our kids, and we always do in youth work and kids work, because it's one of those ones we can act out. Get the children up, they can walk around, they can pretend to blow trumpets, they can shout and scream, and then we get to a certain point and we can show the walls of Jericho falling. But my question to you is, did you ever recite verse 21 to the children if you were doing this story? Because verse 21 says, then they devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep and donkeys. Now, I accept that I look at the Hebrew scriptures through the eyes of Jesus Christ because I'm a Christian. I accept that I read it in my understanding of Christianity. But I cannot accept, and I would challenge anyone who tried to argue, that actually the God who promises land says, well, you can have this land, but you're going to have to kill and slaughter and murder the people that are already living there. To me, that does not seem the sort of promise that God would make. So, raising a question about the promised land, is it just solely for Israel, for the Jews? What is it that it means? And I wanted to just sort of do a bit of work around a theologian who died recently, Walter Brueggemann, a Christian theologian who wrote a couple of books about the promised land. And he kind of accepts, he would argue that it was God gives it to Israel and to the Jews. But what he says is, actually, within that promise, there's what he calls the Deuteronomy if. And here's one passage he quotes, Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 16. If you obey the commands of the Lord your God, if you walk in the ways, observing the commandments, decrees and ordinances, the Lord God will bless you in the land that you're about to possess. So he emphasizes the if. In other words, the promised land comes with a way of behaving within it. And he concludes that the land is given to Israel unconditionally, but it is held by Israel conditionally. In other words, what he's saying is it's not a promised land, but it's a land of covenant. In other words, if it is theirs, they've got to behave the way that God wants. And if you read the Hebrew scriptures, if you read the Old Testament, as we call it, then you will see constantly the references to how you treat the foreigner in the land, how you treat your neighbor, how you treat those people that you live alongside. And so for Brueggemann, that's his stance. We can talk more about the Promised Land when we have questions and we can explore that. But I just wanted to share some of those things. Zionism is a word that we will have heard many times. And Zionism is a movement that started at the end of the 19th century. And we know in our history that Jewish people were persecuted, particularly in Europe, for many centuries. And towards the end of the 19th century, there was this growth of this movement called Zionism that Herzl, who's pictured here, is considered to be one of the fathers of. And basically, it was a movement that said that Jews should have a land where they can have self-determination and safety free from persecution. And as the movement started, it was mainly a secular movement. In other words, it wasn't religious Jews that were putting forward this idea, because many rabbis, if not all at the time, were saying, if God wants us to have the land, God will give us the land when God's ready to give us the land. But Herzl and his colleagues actually started to say, you know what, we need to be active and politically active to ensure that we can have a land that we can call our own and we can protect ourselves and live in security. And this definition that I have put up here has the final line, which says Zionism wanted to create a Jewish state in Palestine with as much land and as many Jews and as few Palestinian Arabs as possible. I think for some people that's quite a controversial definition. But I want to just offer you one or two more examples of what Zionism looks like. So in 1923, there was an essay written, and it was called The Iron Wall. And it was written by this guy, Jabotinsky. I can never say it properly. And in this essay, basically, he says, if the Zionist colonization, if it's going to work, then we have to do it regardless of the native population. If we are going to be taking over this land, then we need to put the native population behind an iron wall, which the native population cannot breach. At the time, this was considered by many Zionists to be a bit extreme. It was considered to be not the sort of Zionism they were talking about. Some Zionists talk about an Israel being a land of light, a land of healing, etc., etc. But the reason I mention this is because 100 years later, July 2023, the current Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, actually made reference to that essay and says, 100 years after the Iron Wall, we are continuing to successfully implement these principles. So this extreme Zionism has very much become part of the current government and the current way in which the Prime Minister sees what Zionism actually is. And if you go to the West Bank, there's not an iron wall, but there is a concrete wall. And something of what the housekeeper was talking about in the restrictions in his life are because he is part of the native population that has been put behind a wall and controlled. Now, I have quite a few Israeli and Jewish friends that I know, and they would see it differently. And this is a quote from one of my friends who is a US-born Jew who's now living in Israel. And she said, "My Zionism has respect and room for Palestinians and a Palestinian state. That's what I came here to build." But she's not in the government. And actually what we have seen over the life of this government is that extreme view of Zionism, although I would argue that we have seen that extreme view over the last 58 years or so, but it's been accelerated and exaggerated under the current government. So I used the phrase settler colonialism in the introduction, and I've been challenged by my Palestinian friends to use this phrase much more. They say to me, "David, why do you and your friends in the West call it a conflict zone? Why do you talk about a war? Why do you talk about the trouble and everything that's happening? Why don't you call it what it is?" And I say to them, "Well, what is it? What do you call it?" And they say, "It's settler colonialism." And I said, "Okay, right." And then they say to me, "Is it because you're a Brit you don't want to use this language?" And I say, why that? They say, "Well, you wrote the textbook on this sort of thing. Is that why you won't use the word?" And of course, what settler colonialism is settler, as in people coming into the land, settling in the land, and then colonialism, actually trying to change the culture and take away the existing culture and way of living that is in the land. And so I want to show you, and some of you will have seen this before, I know, but I think this helps us just to see what settler colonialism has looked like over the last 150 years. And so what we've got up here is we've got a map, a familiar shape. You'll have seen this shape very often in our news reports over the last 2 years. And the yellow on these maps will represent Palestine and Palestinians. And this map is roughly from, it says 1917 because that's a key date. And what you see is the majority of the land is inhabited by Palestinians. They are living under the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is coming towards the end. It's been hundreds of years the Ottoman Empire has existed. And Palestinians are actually looking forward to a land to call their own, where they have self-determination, where they'll be able to say, "This is our land, we're Palestinians," and they can govern and rule themselves. Of course, 1917 is an important date as well, because I mentioned before Zionism, we've got the growth of Zionism, and what happens in 1917 is that the Foreign Secretary, the UK Foreign Secretary, actually writes to a prominent businessman, Jewish businessman, and says in that letter that there will be a Jewish homeland in Palestine and the Brits want to make it happen. That Foreign Secretary is called Balfour. That has become known as the Balfour Declaration. And it's a really important declaration for Zionists because they really believe that's the moment when they knew that they were going to be able to have a land. The Brits, however, had also made a promise to Arabs in the land. The Brits were really keen to see an end to the Ottoman Empire. And the First World War was an opportunity the Brits saw to challenge the Ottoman Empire and to bring it down. And so they promise Arabs in the land, they say, "Fight with us against the Ottoman Empire and we'll give you some land that you can call your own." So 2 promises. Meanwhile, the Brits and the French have also divided up the whole of the Middle East in an agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So the UK foreign policy is basically making 3 promises that you cannot keep simultaneously. So 1917, the British have a mandate to govern in Palestine, and what we see between then and this map's it says 1945, of course, we see the growth of green in here, which represents Israeli communities, Jewish communities, actually in the land. And what is happening between the wars is with a lot of Jewish people are looking for somewhere to feel safe, somewhere to be safe. And a lot of people, the Jewish people, start moving to Palestine. And with the rise of the Third Reich in Germany, and of course, everything that we know, the horrendous genocide of the Holocaust, actually there's a lot of Jewish people trying to find safety. There's also a lot of land being bought by what's known as the Jewish National Fund, which is a fund that is funded by Jews globally to enable land to be bought. And so you see these green bits coming into Palestine, which are Jewish communities in Palestine. And after the Second World War, we have a big influx of Jewish people because, we've witnessed the horrendous Holocaust, and basically Jewish people are saying, right, when are we going to have safety and security? And so the Brits are trying to govern Palestine. It's very difficult to govern at the time. There is violence. There is violence always. So there's violence between Jews and Palestinians. There's violence between Jews and the Brits. There's violence between the Palestinians and the Brits. The Brits are trying to rule it with force, and it's not working. It's not working at all. And so Britons decide that they're going to withdraw in 1948, and they say to the United Nations, draw up a partition plan for Israel and Palestine. And so in 1947, the UN draw up this as a partition plan. Now, there's two immediate questions about this that need to be asked. Yeah. Firstly, you'll notice there's far more green than yellow. So under the partition plan, the Zionists, the Jews, were given more land than the Palestinians. The second thing is, who on earth thought that it was a good idea to have three separate bits of land to be one country, Palestine? And so you see right at the top, up north, there's a bit that was going to be Palestine. And then you see the biggest bit of yellow, which is what we call the West Bank, because it's on the west bank of the Jordan. And then we see the L shape down at the bottom, which is Gaza. Palestinians said, no, this doesn't work for us. We do not want this. Partly because they said we're losing more than 50%. It's not fair. The Jews and the Zionists said, yes, thank you very much, we'll take that. And then the UN voted on it. Now, the Palestinians had no vote at the UN, but the UN said, yeah, this is a good idea, we'll vote for it. And so in 1948, the Brits withdraw, and immediately the state of Israel is declared, and there is a war between the Arab countries around and Israel. And what happens in that war when Israel win is that actually this is what it looks like. So you see that the bit up north of Palestine just disappears. The West Bank becomes a lot smaller, and Gaza becomes a lot smaller, because during that war, Israel not only won the war, but they took more land. And you have about 750,000 Palestinians being displaced from their land and forced into either the West Bank, Gaza, or into the countries around, like Syria and Lebanon and Jordan and Egypt. The next map I'm going to show you, you'll say, hang on a minute, that looks exactly the same. And it does look exactly the same, but that's because this is a key date. And this is 1967 and the Six-Day War. And what happens in 1967 is that Israel, as a result of that Six-Day War, occupy the West Bank and Gaza. In other words, since 1967, Israel has been ruling the Palestinian land of the West Bank and Gaza. So Palestinians have been living under military law and military rule. And I just want to show you this one, which is, this says current day, just to show you what's happening within the West Bank. And I think this is really important. So what you see is more green in the West Bank. And that's because since 1967, Israel has continually grabbed land within the West Bank. And they do this through building illegal settlements. They're illegal because under international humanitarian law, you're not allowed to build in land you occupy, and you're not allowed to move your population into that land that you occupy. They do it by, I've mentioned the wall already, the concrete wall. This was built after the Second Intifada, and Israel gave the reason to be security because the Second Intifada is an Arabic word that means uprising, was violent. There were suicide attacks in Israel. There were bombs on buses, etc. And the wall was built as a security measure. But they didn't build it along any of the agreed borders. It snakes into the West Bank and actually cuts off Palestinians from land. And so they've land grabbed. There is a settler movement, which is different to the settlements I've already mentioned. And if you've seen the Louis Theroux documentary, The Settlers, this is the movement of Israelis and Jewish people who just claim land themselves. They will plant an Israeli flag, create an outpost, and build a settlement. So that's another way in which they grab land. So we see a lot of the West Bank disappearing in terms of Palestinian land. And Palestinians will say to you, they have this joke. It's not a funny joke, but they say, two-state solution. No, Israel's much more generous than that. They're giving us Bethlehem and Ramallah and Tulkarm. They're giving us 10 states, not 2. But it's symbolic of what is happening. Basically, there are Bantustans that are being built in the West Bank. In other words, small communities that contain Palestinians, and the rest of the land will be Israel. So what's settler colonialism? What does it look like to an individual? So this young woman that's in the middle of this photograph wearing the white shirt and white t-shirt, she's called Alice. She is a Palestinian. She lives in her land and her family land is behind her head, the mound that you see. This is the Al Makrour Valley, which runs from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. And her family have lived there for generations. And last year, settlers, as the type that Louis Theroux interviewed, came into their house and drove them out of the house, forced them out. Settlers, they're armed, not just with a pistol, they're armed with rifles and all sorts of things, and drove the family out. Alice is, she's very good with social media and everything, so she documented all of this, and she, was able to get a lot of support from around the world, and she also took it to the Israeli court and said, this isn't right, this is our land. And the Israeli court said, yeah, okay, and told the settlers they had to leave. But Alice and her family are still not allowed to go back to their home because the Israeli court are saying, we haven't quite decided whose land it is. Another couple of words that I mentioned were apartheid and oppression. And I just want to share a story that I think illustrates the depth of what the oppression of Palestinians looks like. So this is a piece of land that you see on this picture. It's actually, this side of the fence is called the Tent of Nations. It's a farm owned by a Palestinian Christian family, and they've been fighting to keep the land for over 30 years. And what you're seeing happening here, what you see beyond are the illegal settlements that I'm talking about, settlements built by Israel on what should be Palestinian land. And what you're seeing here is containers being planted right up against the fence. And the family were really worried that this was going to be another settlement. And why they were worried is because if there is a settlement, there has to be a buffer zone if there are Palestinians next to it. And so what it would have meant was that this land, this bit of green here, would have been taken up and the family would have lost that bit of land. And then, of course, if you're a settler, what you then do is build a house in the buffer zone, and of course it then has to move back again. So they were really worried. It turned out it wasn't to be accommodation, it was to manufacture. And what they were manufacturing in these containers are these, what you see here, this red metal gate, these gates. They were manufacturing these gates. These gates have appeared across the West Bank. When there was a ceasefire at the beginning of the year in Gaza, Israel turned its attention to the West Bank, and over 100 of these gates appeared around Bethlehem. This is actually Hebron. This was a time I was taking a group to Hebron, and this is the way we'd normally go into Hebron. We got there, the gates were shut. We could not go into Hebron. We found another way round, but we couldn't go the way we wanted to go. And these gates are appearing across the West Bank. It's part of what I was talking about in terms of concentrating Palestinians into small areas. And these were being manufactured next to the Tent of Nations. And when I spoke to the family there, they said, "You do realise, David, that the labourers making these gates are not Israeli, they're Palestinians. They are making the mechanism of their own oppression. And they are forced to do it, not by gunpoint, but by the fact that the economy is so bad in the West Bank that they face a choice. Either they get paid for making these gates, or they end up not being able to feed their family." And this isn't the only sort of story. There are stories of settlers driving Palestinians off land, knocking down their house, and then employing the person that used to live there to build the new house. Or stealing flock, and then employing the Palestinian to look after the flock that used to be theirs. It's happening right across the West Bank. This is how deep the oppression actually goes. I mentioned the word apartheid, and it's been a word that people have argued about for a long time to do with the Israeli regime. This year, a couple of months ago, the World Council of Churches actually produced this report and said that the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches actually calls for the naming of the reality of apartheid as far as the Israeli regime is concerned. At both the Methodist Conference this year and the URC General Assembly, both bodies actually received this report and endorsed it, and have sort of said, yes, we recognise this is what is happening. Of course, we know apartheid from South Africa, but actually apartheid is mentioned under international humanitarian law. It is mentioned as being illegal, and in a very sort of basic definition, it is when one group of people exists under a different law to somebody else in the same land. This is happening to the Palestinians. And a very quick example, a very simple example, if you are Israeli and you commit a crime in the West Bank, you are tried under Israeli civil law. If you're a Palestinian and you commit a crime, you are tried under Israeli military law. More and more people are identifying this as apartheid. I have been in the West Bank with a friend of mine who is a white South African who grew up as a white South African Christian supporting apartheid because that's what they understood and were told, and that it was of God, who has traveled on a long journey and has come to realize that it's not of God and it was wrong. But his words to me were, don't let anyone tell you it's not apartheid. And also, let me tell you, it is far worse in Palestine than it was in South Africa. I'm not going to say a lot about Gaza because we've seen so much on our news. What I will say is, when the world looks back at this time, when we look back in history, there will be serious questions asked as to how we allowed what to happen in Gaza to happen. October the 7th, the attack by Hamas was horrendous, but the response by Israel, I don't think there's any words for it. war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law have been multiple. And as a Brit, I find it unbelievable that we have a Prime Minister who has been decorated for his human rights work as a lawyer, who has stood by and allowed these human rights to be violated. For weeks at the beginning of this year, there was no aid going into Gaza. There's been very little aid for 2 years, but there was no aid going in for weeks. The Gazans were starved by Israel. Starvation, you cannot use starvation as a weapon of war. And now you then set up with an agency that has no experience of giving out aid in these sorts of situations. You set up 4 distribution points, all within military zones. So you force a population to go into a military zone to get food, and then they are shot at, they are shelled. And I know people have said to me, that's not true. Or they've said to me, it's Hamas. There is growing and a deep body of evidence from IDF soldiers who are saying, this is what we have been told to do, to shoot at Gazans as they come for food. It is a disgrace that we have allowed this to happen. I'm going to stop now. You've listened to a lot, and it is a complex situation, but it's also sometimes quite simple in the injustices that we see. And I could talk lots more, but I'm going to stop, and I'm going to say, let's open it up for questions. Just before we do, what I will say is when you give your question, I'll repeat the question because we are filming it so that it will be heard, and then I'll try and answer the question. Okay.
What's the point of you being in Jerusalem?
Yep. Okay, so the question is, what is the point of me being in Jerusalem? That's actually a really good question. I know it might sound a bit rude, but I think it's a really good question. We should not underestimate the power of being present in this situation. So I tell this story quite often. Whenever we get visitors, and I organize solidarity visits, people come to meet with human rights organizations, people working for justice, people working for peace, with Christian communities in Palestine. And I always, the people that we meet always say to us, thank you for being here. And they say thank you to the people that have come for 5, 14 days, however long it is, because it means so much for people to know that people care and care enough to be there. So in terms of what's the point of me being there, yes, it's about presence. It's about saying that the Methodist Church is not ignoring what is happening, and we are there to try and hear the voices of those people in the land and what's actually happening. Sometimes it amuses me. Thankfully Stuart didn't do it when he introduced me, but sometimes people say, oh, we've got the Reverend David Hardman to speak to us. He's a peacemaker in the Middle East. If only I could be. If only I could. But actually, I can't emphasize enough and amplify enough how much it means just to be there. And in particular, Palestinian Christians. Because they actually are quite angry with the church in the West. They're angry because they feel like their sisters and brothers in Christ are not supporting them, are not speaking out enough. And so to have an office there and have a Methodist minister, and normally there's a British Methodist minister and an American Methodist minister, to have 2 Methodist ministers there who haven't got a church, who don't have to look after a congregation, but are there to be a presence and to be alongside, they find it very powerful. And so I've had to learn as a minister what it means to be a ministry of presence rather than a ministry of doing. Because to be honest, for most of my life as a minister, I've had a diary that's been full from 9 o'clock till 9 o'clock at night, and I go from one thing to another, and I tick it off at the end of the day, and I've done my job. Whereas actually being out here in Jerusalem, It's about being there and being alongside. And then, of course, part of the usefulness is doing this, is being able to share those stories, to amplify the voices of those people who are suffering. Thank you. Yeah.
As far as interactions with Israeli civilians,
Yeah.
what's the kind of narrative that they're buying into? How much do you end up having to have conversations that actually fall on deaf ears? Are people willing to listen to it, or is it just that they're just so fixed on their narrative they're completely closed off to other interpretations?
Yeah. A caveat to that question is I can't speak for every Israeli person. I know you know that, but it's difficult to say, oh, well, Israelis think this, Israelis think that. I think one of the things that I've witnessed in the last 2 years, so since October the 7th, is that the way in which October the 7th, I mean, horrendous as the attack was, and I don't want to, and we need to understand that it went deep into Israeli psyche, what happened to them. Because they felt that they were secure. They had built what they thought was a secure way of keeping them safe. And that was just, disappeared on that morning. But it has been memorialized and it has been used to sort of very much, I think, sort of move quite a few people to the state where they're sort of saying, we've got to get rid of the Palestinians. And so for some people, that's where they are. So some people who might have been a bit moderate at one point, they have moved. And so it is difficult sometimes. And I understand, when you hear one thing and when you are, when we're all in our bubbles, and when we hear the same thing, we think that's the absolute truth. So it can be really, really difficult. And I think it's more difficult, not so much for myself, but for some of the Israelis that I know. I've got a friend who's an Orthodox Jew, and he does a lot of work with Palestinians. And he says to me, I don't feel at home in Israel anymore. I live in my village, and they know that I actually not only stand up for human rights for Palestinians, I actually actively involved in ensuring it happens, or trying to ensure it happens. And he says, I don't feel at home there because they don't like it. He also says when he goes into the West Bank to stand alongside Palestinians, he says they're suspicious of him, which is understandable. And he says, I understand it, we get over it, but I don't feel at home. So I think for there's many Israelis who are trying to, like the quote I did before, a different person who said, my Zionism has a place for Palestinians, it has a place for a Palestinian state. They are finding it very difficult because the narrative has shifted. And so, in terms of my interaction, yeah, and very often it's hard for me if I'm talking to Israelis, they immediately say to me, you don't understand. You've come here, you live here for a few months and you're trying to tell us what to do. I'm Israeli, I've been here, you don't understand, you need to understand. And I'm quite happy to listen and try and get a sense of what it is, but sometimes it's hard for me to be able to put across that voice of the Palestinians that I hear so often. So it's not an easy thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah. When this first happened, when Hamas attacked 1,200 actually, I have a friend whose daughter married, she went working on a production, then married and her two grandsons were at that event.
Yeah.
And up the one man, they did some shrubs and one end of the building, and they were comparatively safe. But I wonder what was the response of the Palestinians when that happened?
Yeah.
What did they, I thought, they're not going to put up with this. I expect it to be horrendous, not as horrendous as it is. I agree with you, it's beyond compare. Words can't describe it now.
Yeah.
But what would the average Palestinian be thinking? Like, was that a sensible thing to do, or did they support Hamas?
Okay, so the question is around what the ordinary Palestinian felt about the Hamas attack, and do they support Hamas? And we hear what you're saying about relatives that you have and were part at that music festival when it was attacked. Again, I can't speak for every Palestinian, but I was living in the West Bank on October the 7th. and I know many Palestinians, and the ones that I know, the ones that I talked to, all really said the same thing. They said, why have Hamas done this? There is only one people that will suffer, and that will be the Palestinians. So and again, I don't think they quite envisaged, as you said, that there was going to be a response, but they didn't imagine it was going to be like this. But Hamas, they're not widely supported. There are supporters of Hamas, and there are those Palestinians who believe the only way is to have a violent struggle to end the occupation. I myself, I cannot condone any kind of violence. I cannot do it. But what I would say is that if that had been widespread, if most Palestinians thought there needs to be an armed struggle, we would have seen in the West Bank and in Gaza many more deaths over the last 57 years of occupation. Because there have been so many Palestinians, the vast majority of Palestinians have resisted this occupation non-violently and still continue to. The problem is that there is probably 2 generations of young Palestinians who have seen no political intent to actually bring a solution, to end the occupation, to bring justice, and therefore build peace. And so there are, amongst some of the younger Palestinians, just this feeling of like, we might as well turn to arms, because if we die, but we've got nothing to live for. And Netanyahu said immediately, we're going to destroy Hamas, we'll get the hostages back. He's done neither. He's got some hostages back, he hasn't got them all back, and we pray that they will return soon. But what he's also done in Gaza is he has done the best recruitment campaign for Hamas that anyone could have devised. And there is evidence of 15,000 Gazans signing up to become Hamas fighters. I think that's the figures. But, because they are going, what can we do? And when they've seen 19 months of this bombardment, of starvation, of all the rest of it, the more people are willing to turn to arms. So it is worrying. But I would, Hamas are not, not every Palestinian supports Hamas, not every Palestinian supports an armed struggle. And I think the evidence shows that most Palestinians have tried to resist it non-violently, but the world hasn't responded to it. And so I'm fearful for what might happen. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
Should our country support the nation of Palestine, and what difference would it make if we did?
Yeah, okay. So question about whether or not our country should support and recognise Palestine as a state, and what is the difference if we do that. So obviously there's a lot around at the moment about, the French have said that they will recognise Palestine as a state. And there's pressure on Keir Starmer to do it. So the first thing to say is the British government voted over 10 years ago to recognise Palestine as a state when the time was right. So the Parliament has agreed that we can do it. So it's just a question of whether or not our politicians think the time is right. I think we should recognise Palestine as a state. And the reason I say that is because what happens when you recognise a country as a state? It's a little bit complex what happens, but the more countries that recognise another country as a legitimate state raises the profile of that state. So, for instance, in the United Nations, a few years ago, Palestine reached a level whereby people were recognising them as a state, which meant that they could have observer status at the United Nations. So there's lots of people who have recognised them as a state. If France and the UK were to recognise them as a state, that would add to the numbers, and I think also other countries would follow, because I think we still would be an example. And what it means when you get to the magic number, where you can have full status at the United Nations, where the world recognises you as a state, you actually then start to have control over things that Palestinians don't have control over anymore, or at the moment. So, for instance, Palestinians have no control over the airspace over the West Bank or Gaza. They don't have any control, the maps aren't there, but they don't have any control over the waters that are next to Gaza. In fact, Israel says to people in Gaza, you can only take boats out so far, and then if you go any further, we will fire on you, the Israeli Navy. So those sorts of things actually make a bit of a difference, especially as there's oil reserves in the sea next to Gaza. So it allows them to have self-determination as well. And I think the other thing it would do, which is why I think we should do it, and I think the time is right, is because if you're going to have a peace process, and we need a ceasefire, we need the return of the hostages, and then we need a peace process. But actually, if the world recognises Palestine as a state, then I believe that that gives them a more level negotiating position to come from, which I think is vitally important. I think the peace process, as we've seen before, Israel has held the power and has used it. Now, the British government has often said, we'll recognise the state of Palestine as part of a peace process. I think that's totally wrong. I think you have to recognise it first, put pressure on others to do it so that we can have a more equal conversation, mediation, and a process to bring about some kind of just solution. There is also a question, you didn't ask it, but I'll move on, because people talk about the two-state solution. And people say, well, you're recognising Palestine as a state, that means there will be a two-state solution. Our politicians say there should be a two-state solution. I would actually say the two-state solution is not going to work because Israel have taken too much land in the West Bank. But you can have a binational one-state solution. And in that, you have two states that share one land with equal rights, with equal access to the land. And that's why I think it's really important now to recognise Palestine as a state, because I think the only solution is a one-state solution. It's not an easy solution, and it will take a lot of discussing. But if Palestine don't have the same level, then Israel, it won't be a fair solution. So I actually would argue strongly that we need to, and it does, I think it will make a difference to any future way in which we sort the issue out. Any other questions?
Well, sorry, I cannot understand how Hamas got into Israel if the surveillance on that border was of high world-class efficiency, and why there appears to be no soldiers at that music festival. Besides having a music festival on one side of the border when you've got oppressed people on the other.
I think there's lots of questions. There are lots of questions about what happened on October the 7th. I worry we won't get the full answers, but I think they're important questions to ask. So, I visited Gaza about a year before October the 7th, 2023. And I went from Israel, and I went through an Israeli checkpoint with full airport security. I then went through a Palestinian Authority checkpoint, and then I went through a Hamas checkpoint till I eventually got into Gaza. Going into Gaza, you could see one of these, they have these big sort of surveillance balloons that's just hovering over Gaza. And these things can see and hear for miles. One night when I was in Gaza, I was followed down the road by a drone. So the surveillance is as people say it is. The other thing that happens, or well, happened around Gaza, was they had an IDF unit that surveilled with just using eyes, etc. I think there is very clear evidence, very clear, I don't think you can argue it, that Israel were told that something was being planned. The IDF unit have said it themselves. We fed back that something was being planned. The people that live in the kibbutz around that suffered the brunt of the attack, they could hear. It might be a 30-foot concrete wall, but you can hear what goes on the other side of it. And they were hearing things, so they knew. The BBC, shortly afterwards, found training videos online, which looked very much like Hamas training videos for what was going to happen. Now, if the BBC could find it online, I'm pretty certain that the Israeli security forces could find it online. So why didn't something happen? Why didn't Israel defend itself better? I think there is, I can't give the answer to this because we don't know the answer. I think one thing could have been that there was, they were too sure of themselves and they had these reports and thought, nah, it'll never happen. It won't happen. We don't need to bother. So the reports went so far up the chain and people went, yeah, we don't need to bother about it. The worst case scenario, and I'll be accused of a conspiracy theory by saying this, but I'm just giving it as an example of a worst case scenario, is that it did go all the way to the top and they ignored it. The music festival, I think there are questions about why the music festival was where it was. My understanding was that actually the venue was changed very close to the time. Now, I don't know whether that's, again, you have to be so careful with information, and so that's something I've read, that's something that I've heard. Is it absolutely true or not? I could not say, but that's kind of what I've heard. But there is just something that doesn't sit right, does there, about, I've got nothing against music festivals. I think we should have more music festivals personally. They're a great place where people come together, they form community, all the rest of it. But having a music festival there, like you say, when you've got, and I don't know if we understand quite how oppressed Gazans actually were before October the 7th. People, I'm trying to think of the exact figures, but people were food insecure. People were unemployed. People couldn't get out of Gaza. When I left Gaza, it took me hours to get out of Gaza, but I was standing there with really ill children who were trying to get out to get treatment. And they were only being allowed out with their grandparents because Israel wouldn't give a permit to their parents to leave Gaza because they were scared that they wouldn't come back. But they felt that if the grandparents were given a permit, then they would bring the children back. The moment the gate opened to try and get through, you had to really force yourself through. You've got grandparents, and I'm talking really, really ill children in wheelchairs. They couldn't get through in time. The oppression for the Gazans was, massive. And so there does seem to be just this, this celebration of life and all that is good at a music festival right next to people who are quite literally barricaded in. Doesn't seem right at all. So I think there are questions. I think what I've read, and I've read widely, I think we cannot deny that people knew and people reported something was being prepared. Did they know it was going to happen that day? Did they know what it was going to entail? I don't know. But the intelligence was there, and somewhere up the chain it was not listened to or acted upon. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. If you've got a question you didn't want to ask me in front of everybody else, I'm going to be around for a while, so come and grab me and ask me that. If not, go and visit Kathy on the stall, and thank you once again for being here. It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you.